The CEO had built his empire with grit, ambition, and relentless determination, climbing through decades of competition until his company stood as one of the most recognized names in the industry. For years, the system he had trusted, the very heart of the company's operations, had functioned without flaw, managing billions in transactions, storing sensitive data, and maintaining the intricate connections that kept the global machine running. But on that particular morning, the unthinkable happened. The screens that usually glowed with numbers and progress went dark one after the other. Alarms rang across departments, and chaos began to ripple through the corporate headquarters like wildfire. Phones wouldn't connect, servers refused to respond, and every second of downtime was costing the firm not just money, but reputation. The CEO stood in his office, staring at the frozen display, knowing that the world outside was watching and waiting for an explanation. His team rushed into the boardroom with updates that only made his heart sink further. Data streams were locked, client accounts inaccessible, investors demanding immediate clarity, and journalists circling like vultures waiting to declare the downfall of a giant. The company's fate rested on the stability of that system, a web so complex that even the senior engineers hesitated when asked for answers. What made the moment even more devastating was the timing. An international deal worth billions was scheduled to finalize within the next few hours, and failure to deliver would not just cost money, but also trust from partners who had been courted for years. The CEO tried to keep his composure, but the cracks began to show as he rubbed his temples, aware that his entire legacy was unraveling before his eyes. Every suggestion from his executives seemed hollow. Reboot protocols failed. Backup servers refused to sync. The tech department scrambled through endless lines of code, but the deeper they dug, the more entangled the problem seemed to become. Outside the boardroom, employees whispered about the downfall of the company, some even fearing layoffs if the crisis wasn't resolved. The CEO, once seen as a man who always had an answer, now sat slumped in his chair, the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders. He thought of the shareholders, the thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on the company, and the millions of customers who trusted their systems daily. His confidence began to drain away, replaced with the suffocating awareness that he might be remembered as the man who lost everything in a single day. For the first time in his career, he admitted defeat to himself. His eyes drifted around the boardroom, filled with screens that refused to light up and faces that reflected fear rather than solutions. His chief financial officer whispered grim numbers into his ear, millions bleeding away by the minute. The chief technology officer shook her head with each attempt, her voice breaking as she admitted they might not be able to recover in time. And with each passing second, the CEO's hopes slipped further from his grasp. This was not the ending he had envisioned for his life's work. He had fought through recessions, survived hostile takeovers, and weathered global crises, but nothing had ever cornered him like this silent, merciless crash. He felt powerless, a man stripped of control in the very place where he once ruled with certainty and authority. His thoughts darkened as he imagined the inevitable headlines. Titan of industry falls in hours. System crash brings down Fortune 500 giant. He could almost hear the mocking tone of rivals, the sorrow of loyal employees, and the disappointment of investors who had placed their faith in him. It wasn't just a system failure, it was personal. The company was his creation, his reflection, his very identity. And now, in front of his board, he felt like a king without a crown, watching his kingdom crumble. The silence that followed each failed attempt was unbearable, as if the walls themselves were closing in. He clasped his hands together, lowering his head, unable to mask the despair that consumed him. For the first time, those closest to him saw not the confident leader who had always steered them through stormy waters, but a man who had lost all hope. In the middle of the frenzy, when executives barked orders and specialists tapped frantically at their keyboards, the presence of one quiet figure went unnoticed. For years, the maid had walked those same polished halls, mopping floors, dusting the high glass windows, and ensuring that the offices of the most powerful men and women remained spotless. She had been invisible to the people who built fortunes in that tower, a shadow moving silently behind the glow of wealth and influence. Her son had grown up alongside her labor, watching as she returned home each evening exhausted yet determined, her hands roughened by work that no one applauded. On that day, however, fate placed him in the very building where his mother had always been overlooked. He wasn't dressed in a suit, nor did he carry the air of entitlement that executives wore like armor. But he carried with him something far more valuable: knowledge sharpened in obscurity, a mind tuned to systems, and a perspective unclouded by corporate arrogance. The boy had often waited for his mother after her shifts, tinkering with her old phone or fixing small gadgets in the lounge while employees walked past without sparing him a glance. They saw him as just the maid's son, a presence that didn't register in their hierarchy of importance. What they didn't know was that he had been studying, experimenting, and pushing himself into the digital world since he was old enough to understand how circuits and code worked. His education didn't come from prestigious universities or elite internships, but from nights spent teaching himself programming languages, absorbing tutorials, and dismantling broken devices to understand their secrets. While others dismissed him, he quietly built a reservoir of knowledge that no one recognized, not even the company whose offices he wandered while waiting for his mother to finish cleaning that day. When the system crashed and panic swallowed the building, he watched from a corner as grown men and women in $1,000 suits shouted into dead phones and cursed at frozen screens. His mother tried to usher him away, sensing the tension in the air, but he lingered, eyes scanning the monitors with curiosity rather than fear. He noticed the patterns others didn't, the errors hidden in the noise, the small signals that hinted at a deeper flaw beneath the surface. Where the company's tech team saw an impossible wall, he saw cracks, entry points, and the possibility of repair. It wasn't arrogance but clarity. His mind processed the chaos differently, cutting through the panic that clouded the judgment of those who had everything to lose. Wordlessly, he stepped closer to the boardroom, catching the attention of a few who raised their brows at the audacity of the maid's son, standing among executives. Some sneered, others ignored him, but desperation had softened the sharp edges of their pride. When he asked to see the terminal, a wave of disbelief washed over the room. How could this boy, in sneakers and a plain shirt, possibly contribute when the best minds in the company had already failed? His mother, standing near the door with her cleaning cart, flushed with embarrassment, fearing that her son's intrusion would cost her the little respect she had managed to hold in this environment. But he didn't waver. He had seen something they had missed, and in that moment he couldn't silence the urge to act. The CEO, broken by the mounting despair, barely noticed him at first. It was only when the boy repeated his request, calmly, with a quiet confidence, that the room paused. Some executives scoffed openly, muttering about wasting time. Yet there was something in the boy's eyes, a certainty that contrasted sharply with the doubt that clouded everyone else. The CEO, stripped of alternatives, gave a weary nod, signaling for the boy to approach. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. The idea of letting a maid's son touch the core systems bordering on madness in their eyes. But the boy didn't flinch under their scrutiny. He walked to the console, fingers hovering above the keys, with the ease of someone who had long been waiting for this moment. As he began to work, the atmosphere shifted. The clattering of his keystrokes echoed against the silence of the boardroom. Each command entered with precision and speed. The boy's face remained calm, focused, his mind moving through pathways that the highly paid engineers had overlooked. He navigated the system like a diver, moving through dark waters, unafraid of what lay beneath, guided only by instinct and the knowledge he had painstakingly built over the years. Executives leaned forward, watching as lines of code scrolled rapidly across the screen, each adjustment unraveling the knots that had strangled the system. His mother stood frozen, torn between pride and fear, her eyes fixed on her son as he worked with the confidence she had always known but no one else had ever cared to see. With each passing second, the tension in the room thickened, the kind of silence that weighed on shoulders and turned breaths shallow. The boy's fingers moved across the keyboard in deliberate rhythm, as if he were not simply typing commands, but weaving threads back into a fabric that had been violently torn apart. At first, there was skepticism, executives exchanging doubtful glances, the chief technology officer biting her lip in frustration at what seemed like a desperate gamble. But then, one by one, subtle changes appeared. Monitors flickered, dormant servers began to hum faintly, and warning lights that had glared crimson for hours softened into amber, then faded altogether. No one dared to speak, not wanting to break the fragile progress unfolding before their eyes. The boy didn't lift his gaze, his attention locked on the sequences that unraveled the corruption buried deep in the system's core. He knew where to look, not because he had ever been inside this particular infrastructure, but because years of study had taught him to see patterns where others saw chaos. The CEO, who had been hollowed by despair minutes before, found himself leaning forward, eyes fixed on the screen, as if his very lifeline were being restored. The boy navigated through layers of security protocols and encrypted networks, with the kind of confidence that suggested an intimate familiarity with digital architecture. It was as though the system had been waiting for someone who could truly listen to it, someone who understood its language beyond manuals and corporate training. His hands worked swiftly, pausing only to analyze before entering precise commands, each keystroke pushing the company closer to salvation. Executives who had dismissed him minutes earlier now found themselves unable to look away, watching not with derision but with awe. The breakthrough came in waves. A screen once frozen with static data suddenly refreshed, pulling in live updates. A communication line that had been severed sparked back to life, phones beginning to ring with clarity once more. The data streams, once jammed and locked, began to flow like unclogged arteries. Murmurs spread around the boardroom as the impossible unfolded before their eyes. This wasn't a patchwork fix or a temporary bandage. It was a surgical repair of the system's very heart. The boy wasn't just restoring function. He was stabilizing it in a way that suggested he understood weaknesses even the architects of the network had overlooked. His every move dismantled doubt and built astonishment. The CEO stood now, unable to remain seated as the weight in his chest lifted for the first time since the crash began. Hope, which had abandoned him hours ago, seeped back in quietly, carried on the sound of servers coming back online. He exchanged glances with his board, and though no words were spoken, their expressions told the same story. What they were witnessing was not ordinary. The boy's presence had gone from dismissed intrusion to commanding attention, his role shifting from outsider to savior in less than an hour. Even the chief technology officer, humbled and wide-eyed, whispered under her breath that she had never seen anyone work with such clarity under pressure. The transformation of the room was almost surreal. Executives who had scoffed at his presence now leaned closer, eager to understand his process. They weren't just relieved. They were astonished, shaken by the realization that the one they had ignored held the solution to their survival. It was not the veteran engineers with polished resumes, nor the senior consultants with towering fees, but the son of the maid who had fixed what none of them could. His mother, still standing by the door with trembling hands clutching the handle of her cart, watched her son with tears welling in her eyes, pride swelling so fiercely it threatened to break her silence. For years she had borne the weight of invisibility, her labor unacknowledged, her presence overlooked. But in this moment, her son's brilliance illuminated not just the room, but her sacrifices as well. The boy pressed the final sequence, and the system surged fully back to life. Screens across the boardroom lit up with live metrics, green lights replacing red, data flowing smoothly once more. The sound of restored connection echoed like music, each chime of a phone, and each alert from a recovered server, a note in a symphony of revival. The room erupted, not with the chaos of earlier, but with stunned disbelief, gasps, and then scattered applause that grew louder until it filled the space. The CEO, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had just occurred, stepped closer, his eyes locked on the boy not with authority, but with gratitude. The transformation of his own demeanor was striking. A man who had lost everything only to see it restored, not by his wealth, power, or connections, but by a figure he would have never imagined. The executives crowded around, asking questions they had no right to demand answers to, their curiosity tinged with awe. The boy, however, did not bask in their sudden admiration. His focus remained on ensuring the system's stability, running final checks, and confirming that no hidden vulnerabilities remained. His movements were calm, deliberate, as if he had been born for this moment. He carried none of the arrogance often seen in prodigies who flaunt their talent, only the steady assurance of someone who knew his worth long before others acknowledged it. The CEO placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that carried both gratitude and recognition, but also an unspoken acknowledgement of his own blindness. He had led a company of thousands, prided himself on vision and foresight, and yet had never looked closely at those who moved quietly in the background. The boy's mother could hardly contain the storm of emotions within her. She had cleaned those floors while hearing executives talk dismissively about people like her. Yet now, those same executives stood humbled before her son. The contrast was overwhelming. Years of invisibility collapsing in an instant as her child became the very person who pulled the company back from the edge of ruin. Whispers spread through the room, not of collapse or disaster, but of rebirth, of the extraordinary way salvation had arrived through someone least expected. The boy had not just fixed a system. He had rewritten the story of that company, leaving an indelible mark on everyone present.